Hello, everybody. I'm Hermione Neville. I'm a tourism specialist with the International Finance Corporation, a member of the World Bank Group. And I'm delighted to be presenting this session for you today on ecotourism and biodiversity. I've been asked to talk a little bit to you about the intersection between nature, biodiversity, and ecotourism. And there's a lot, I think, that can be covered under this topic. So I've decided to focus on three areas. The first is really around the impact story. So making sure that we're talking about measuring and monitoring impact. We're also talking about education and awareness raising. And lastly, we'll be talking about the sustainability of ecotourism operations. So we're going to start off with really why we're talking about biodiversity, why we're talking about nature. What does this mean for ecotourism and why is it important? So the first thing to say is that really it's the most, nature and biodiversity is the most economically important sector in the world. In terms of global GDP, we have around 60% of global GDP dependent on the services and the resources that nature provides. So specifically on ecosystem services, for example, that provide us with soil, with water, with clean air, with pollinators for crops and agriculture. However, we are burning through that natural capital. There are various reports and studies and research that provide the statistics for this, but a couple here to share. So the World Wildlife Fund has noted a decline in wildlife populations by 69% just in the last 50 years. And the UN also reports now that we have 1 million species threatened with extinction and that 40% of Earth's land surfaces are considered degraded. And I think the important thing really to note here is that without biodiversity and ecosystem services, there really is no life, let alone tourism. So biodiversity is essentially all of the services, all of nature, everything we've just talked about that makes up all of the landscapes, all of the seascapes that allow life on Earth. The official definition coming from UNEP last year is the variety of all things and their interactions. And scientists often speak about these in terms of three levels. So species biodiversity, genetic biodiversity, and ecosystem diversity. For us in the tourism space, and particularly on ecotourism, nature is particularly important. So speaking generally, ecotourism depends on natural assets and on the local communities in those areas. Tourism is place-based, it's hyper-local, and it has a very deep connection with these values. So particularly things like pristine wildlife, forests, landscapes, seascapes. These are the things that tourists come to see, to appreciate, and that they value. However, there are, of course, additional layers of local value. So in the areas and the places that you live and work, these ecosystem services are also providing soils and water that sustain communities nearby you. The nature can act as a barrier between human-borne diseases and our own populations, as well as thousands and thousands of medicines and remedies in the health space. We also have a lot of opportunities provided for alternative economies by nature, including research, craft making, and other things alongside tourism. And it is also the place that you live and work and that you value. So keeping it clean, keeping it less polluted makes it a good place for you to live and something that you want to hand down to your future generations. So there is a lot of value associated with nature and biodiversity. So first of all, it's important when thinking about tourism that it's a growing segment. We have, research predicting around 15% growth to 2030 of the ecotourism market. And this demand has been growing for some time. So in terms of profiling, ecotourists are well educated, typically quite well traveled, and are usually deepening an existing connection to nature and biodiversity. Of course, there are some newer tourists coming into the space, and in fact more and more, but often there's an existing appreciation for nature and biodiversity. And operators really need to be able to respond to that demand. So to demonstrate that you recognize and share the value that those tourists are putting on what we've just described about biodiversity, nature, landscapes, seascapes, forests, and that you are able, through the services that you provide, to enhance that appreciation and even to actually improve that value so that you can actually put back something into that system which actually grows the value, so it enlarges the forest or protects species. And this, of course, means being able to describe and measure the value in the first place, to be able to mitigate the impact of your operations that has on biodiversity, and then, of course, to enhance, and we're going to talk a little bit about nature positivity in a minute. So just to focus for a moment on describing and measuring biodiversity, the important thing here in starting operations or in starting to think more strategically about the ecotourism offer is to really get familiar with the with the biodiversity and the nature assets in your area. So really mapping the natural and cultural and biodiversity features in your space, the fauna, so how unique is it, how scarce, how abundant, how relevant is it to tourists, to local culture? The same with the flora and the natural phenomena. And then to be able to really analyze that. So how sensitive is it to visitation? Which features are more vulnerable? Which is most accessible to tourists? Which are most appealing? And then, from there, you can really start to think about the product and what you're able to offer the market. A key part of that, I think, is in realizing that the value that you place on nature in the area that you live and work in is probably shared by other stakeholders around you. And I think building community is a really important part of this initial assessment, working out which are the actors, which are the players who also share some of these values and can share some of the responsibility of this mapping and this analysis. I think in very mature destinations and for very mature ecotourism operations, this can be a very formalized survey and research-based assessment. But I think it's important to start somewhere and begin that inventory, that mapping, that analysis. So moving forward from there, I think being able to describe and measure your impact is the next thing to focus on. And there are many ecotourism standards, there are many guidelines available that can analyze the impact of your operations on the environment that you have. And you can start to measure and track a few indicators. So maybe building up to meeting the whole standard, starting with a few indicators that are perhaps more feasible for you to measure, and taking those forward. How much training do you provide your staff, for example? How much trail maintenance are you doing? How much recycling are you doing? What are your, how much water are you using? All of these types of things that have an impact on that environment that you are trying to preserve and demonstrate the value of to your guests. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those standards in a moment. And lastly, just a bit more detail on that nature positive side. So going beyond the mapping and the tracking of the biodiversity value of your area and going beyond measuring the impact that you have on it, you're also able to know where you can invest for conservation, for preservation, for restoration, to really add the value back into that ecosystem and that area of biodiversity. So this is really the programs and the foundations and the work that you're probably passionate about in terms of conservation and preservation of flora and fauna, etc. So just to touch briefly on standards and certification, the Global Sustainable Tourism Council is really the gold standard for setting these criteria, and they have a lot of resources and online trainings available. And many schemes in the marketplace are either aligned to this criteria or are official partners and collaborators. Maybe to draw attention to one program that has a lot of support. This is the Australian Eco Certification Program, which also combines some of the Green Globe benchmarking. It has recently got recognition from Google and from Booking in terms of actual, online travel agencies and booking platforms, so that any operator who has the certificate from this program is automatically profiled by Booking and Google as having this certification, which again is an interesting indicator to the market when looking for operations and services in the trip. And they have the full criteria available for download, which I think is very useful. Again, to be able to use initially, to take some of the standards, some of the guidelines, and begin implementation. The Botswana Ecotourism Certification System is an interesting one from the continent. It has 250 criteria, and these are based actually on the National Tourism Policy and supplemented by the GSTC criteria. And then another one to look at could also be the ASEAN Ecotourism Standard. And again, that is aligned to the GSTC. And they also publish the criteria for that standard for anyone to see and to use, to encourage people to begin to adhere. Moving now to an example. I've taken the example of Grootbos in South Africa, just to take you through from their website a few of the things that we've just talked about. So this is a page on their on the landing page of their website, and you can see here the evidence of the fact that they really know and understand the biodiversity and the value of the natural asset that they're based on. So they have actually listed the number of species in some cases, the number of endangered species, 23 mammal species, 3 milkwood forests of 1,000 years old, 100 endangered plants. So that as a consumer, you really understand that they understand the values that you're sharing, and they've actually done some of that mapping. From there, you can see that they've built out a wide selection of relevant tours and experiences and excursions based on those values that they have mapped and assessed. So we've got here the botanical 4x4 tour, the horse riding, walks, hikes, bird watching. I mean, the list is extensive. And from there, they then talk about their impact. So the standards that they adhere to. And in the case of this group, Grootbos, they are aligned to the long run, the GER standard, so the Global Ecosphere Retreats. This is the one that they have selected. Again, it has recognition from the GSTC. And they're only one of 10 members to have achieved this, and the only one in South Africa. So they're very proud of this, and they put it on their website, and they talk about the standards that they adhere to, all of the criteria, and how they meet them very transparently. Then to turn to the last point of that section, which was about nature positivity and adding back and actually adding value back into the system. You can see here, again, just very visibly on their website, the things that they are doing to improve on that impact. And you can see here some of the programs and the initiatives that they're working with other stakeholders to partner with and achieve some of these goals. These ones are specifically around conservation, around youth, around community training. There are many more. To move on to the second area that I think is interesting to consider when looking at the intersection between biodiversity and ecotourism is really the ability that tourism has to actually drive that awareness and increase that education around these values that we've just been talking about. So ecotourism can both inspire and grow an appreciation for nature through an emotional connection, which is such an asset for tourism, to be able to make that connection. It can also demonstrate what conservation and good practice look like. And it can go much further than tourism. And I think that's probably something that is familiar to all of you. But inspiring and demonstrating to tourists, yes, but also to your local stakeholders, to neighbors, to the children, the youth, the next generation around you, research organizations, schools, universities, and others. So in terms of making that emotional connection, I think storytelling is important at all stages, and we're always told to tell the story, how to, tell the story. And I think in the case of ecotourism, this really happens both at the marketing level before guests have reached you, but of course, seeing is believing, and really the in-person connections and the stories that you can tell are very valuable indeed. Making sure you have differentiated content, I think, is important in this area. So just as you would devise a different level of content, a different level of information and experience, for example, a children's group in your ecotourism lodge or operation, so you might want to consider for groups that maybe haven't had much exposure or had much interest in ecotourism versus some of the groups that really have a very good understanding and grounding and want to dive more into special interest or niches. So in the marketplace, newer ecotourists may respond better to sort of bigger universal themes around charismatic species, lions, elephant, or baobab trees, something that has a real iconic kind of resonance in their own awareness, or as well as popular culture things like movies, The Lion King being an obvious one in places like Madagascar and South Africa. But deeper content can really go into the specific niches around, maybe it's botanicals, maybe it's a lesser known fauna type of bird, something like that. And again, I think most tourists respond much better to positive messaging than negative. So messages around join us in saving our trees tend to resonate a bit more sharply than don't let our forests die. People want to feel part of something, feel a connection to a place, and that they're contributing positively to this part of the kind of storytelling, awareness, and education that the language used can be important to. Guides, as we all know, are really the very important interface between the ecotourists and the nature, the biodiversity, the local communities, the people. And so really investing in guide training and communication skills and being able to really craft that magic for people is very important. And so, of course, the visual is important in terms of imagery, in terms of video content, but once they're bringing this education and awareness can really be explored in all the other senses as well: touch, taste, audio, etc. The immersion is what tends to stay with people. So again, just to take an example from Root Boss here, we're looking at their 4x4 botanical safari, and you can look at some of the language here. I found it interesting. Soak up the serenity in shaded glades, feel the wind in your hair, get perspective looking down from mountain peaks. These are really kind of big, emotional parts of the story that they're trying to tell. They're trying to put you in the place so that you can imagine feeling it. Keep still, listen intently, and you'll be amazed. They're really talking about the sounds now. And later on, they're talking a little bit about honey. They're talking about the taste. So they're really kind of trying to build this connection, which will help you appreciate the value as a tourist, and raise awareness about the important conservation issues that they want to share. This is an example from And Beyond. They have something called the Wild Child Program, which focuses on the experience of children, so children as tourists rather than local youth. And this is the type of tailoring that I was mentioning before. So the activities and the experience and the educational program that's being delivered under something like this is geared very much towards children, just like you might want to gear another kind of experience towards another sort of group. So in this case, we're doing They're doing, sort of picnics. They do bug trails, spore and dung tracking, bark rubbing, really kind of getting up personal and close to the natural elements in the environment and the biodiversity. And through the expert guides, learning a lot about it on the way, building that awareness, and potentially building a desire to help conserve and preserve nature as they grow older. Very nice resource has just also been produced by Tourism Australia alongside EarthCheck. And this is a guidebook from 2023, end of last year, on sustainability storytelling for sustainability. So this is free to download and the link is there. And it really just takes the reader quite practically through the audience, knowing your audiences and how to communicate those different messages, the ambitions, what are you actually trying to achieve by telling these stories, by these communications, in terms of the actions. So what are these stories getting impact? Are they reaching the right people? What is the desired outcome? And then how to amplify, how to get those voices heard, get the stories reaching even further than they could be. And lastly, wanted to touch a little bit on the third area, the third factor that I think is interesting to explore between biodiversity and tourism, ecotourism operations. And this is really about resilience and stability. And as you'll know very well already, I think, from the operations that you're involved in, you're working with a number of different stakeholders, working with local communities, presumably driving protection of nature and conservation in your local areas, and that is a big responsibility. And I think with that responsibility, there is a need for stability, particularly in financial stability, and being able to ensure that you can meet the targets and you can meet the expectations that you've set. So first of all, a good investment in your business model, making sure that you have cash flows when you need cash flow. So investing in management skills and market intelligence and getting good advice when you need it. Not necessarily to make a profit if you don't have a profit-driven business model, but just to make sure that you are solvent and able to meet your obligations. And what's really, I think, been ever more evident since we've coming out of the COVID pandemic is then the need also for all tourism operators, but particularly ecotourism operators, to make sure that there are alternative revenue streams coming in. So aside from the revenue generated by tourist visits and spending, making sure that if there is another crisis like the one that we've just seen in terms of demand, then some of the obligations and responsibilities that you have can be met through other financial resources. And so I think the most widely used one is agroforestry, also some forms of restorative agriculture, particularly in rural areas. Carbon credits, of course, game management are all sort of nature-based activities and alternative revenue streams, as well as other sort of more nature-compatible revenue streams. For example, consulting services or advisory work if you're working like that in your local community. So I would like to sum up and close there and really say that I think the intersection between biodiversity and ecotourism is vast and important and very inspiring in the work that ecotourism can do and the impact that it can have on nature and biodiversity. And I would encourage all of you to think through these three areas in relation to your own business and operations, and wish you the very best of luck. Thank you.